Again, another person, a woman, inspiration that's been on the journey with me, just not long after Ruby and Nazi joined the journey. And she is absolutely incredible. I mean, she's truly, truly a remarkable woman who has also used her journey of very much shared trauma and losses as well. And she is, she's helping others who are unbreakable like she is. And she truly is unbreakable. And she has some serious, serious words of wisdom. So without further ado, and definitely last but nowhere near the least, is our beautiful, wonderful Sayyida.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Maya gets paid, is going to get paid for every nice word that she's sent my way. But seriously, it's the first time I've actually heard everybody's stories like properly. I think we've heard kind of snippets of the stories, but not fully like this. And I thought, I'm gonna, I'll have it on and I'll get my things done. But I was literally glued for the entire time. But subhanAllah, like there's so much inspiration and so much motivation and so much strength that's coming from these ladies. And I think and I think the whole thing about talking about, these difficult moments and these taboo subjects, I think is so, so important. And I know with myself as well, I think by not being able to speak about it made it even harder to heal as well, because we saw the people around us keep their shit together. You don't have to use that language, but you saw them strong. And I think with our mothers as well, they just went through such difficult times and they just kind of held everything together. So you saw them as role models. And so when you were kind of going through your difficulties or you were going through your challenges, you felt, I can't complain about this. Like my life is so much more easier than what they've been through. And that's probably why I do what I do. And I talk about my own challenges and my own struggles, because sometimes we think that it's showing a weakness, but actually through your weakness, people actually find the strength and they actually look at you and they think, oh, she went through it, and she looks so strong and she looks like as if she's got everything together and she's gone through it and she's went through such a difficult time, or she hit, rock bottom and she's picked herself up from that. And so I think it's so important for us to speak about, are the vulnerable moments that we go through those dark night of the soul that we can call it. It's so important for us to talk about that, because we kind of shine the light for others. So, and you probably agree with, and I'm sure all the women will agree here, that the first time that you spoke about it was like you thought the ground was going to open up and swallow you, or day of judgment was going to come or something. It was like, this is it, life is going to end, if I share my pain and my struggles and my sorrows and those parts of me that I'm holding on so tightly and even not even acknowledging to myself. So yeah, I'm really, really blown away by, all the amazing stories that the women have shared. And inshallah, I want to share, a snippet of my story. Mine starts, I would say, even though I say it starts in 2017, I think, like most of us, we realized that it was probably the turning point, but there was so much trauma in the past as well. So in 2017, I gave birth to my youngest, my son, unexpected pregnancy, baby 5. It's not cool to have 5 children, or so I thought. So it was like, no, this shouldn't be happening. But anyway, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me. And I went through that whole, trying to keep myself calm and accepting God's will. And, alhamdulillah, my pregnancy was difficult. And then my delivery was even more difficult. I got flu just before, like they asked me, do you want the flu jab? And I was like, no, I never get the flu. but lo and behold, I got the flu during my pregnancy, and I couldn't obviously then have the jab. But I got the flu, so I was really unwell. I was struggling to breathe. I went into the hospital, and they had to induce my labor. My labor was quite difficult, and to be honest, all my labors have been quite difficult. So this kind of seemed normal for me. But then there was a few complications, and they had to rush me into emergency C-section. And I'd had a C-section before, so I was kind of familiar with that. So they rushed me into a theatre, and alhamdulillah, I gave birth to my son, and I came out of surgery, and I was still very unwell because I had the flu, and I couldn't hold my baby. I mean, I'd never had this experience before, but the doctors had their masks on. This wasn't during COVID. They had their masks on, they had the aprons on. They had like these special curtains around me. I couldn't hold the baby. So it was quite a really strange kind of environment to have, to have had this baby, to have my son. So as my family's kind of leaving, and my sister-in-law was standing there, and she was kind of the last one to come in to see me. I wasn't feeling so great. And I remember touching the bed, and as I'm like kind of touching the bed, I felt like it was wet. And as I lifted my hands were full of blood. So I'm like, why am I bleeding? So they called the doctor. And actually, no, the nurse came, and the nurse checked one of my stitches. She checked a stitch. She cut one of the stitches just to check. And this gush of blood, like literally just like came out of me. So again, I was like in a state of shock, like, why am I bleeding? And then it was just all kind of panic stations. The doctors are kind of running about. They're trying to get me ready for surgery again. I was hemorrhaging. I didn't realize at the time, but I was hemorrhaging. And so they rushed me back into the theatre. And before they rushed me into the theatre, they made my husband sign like the form that they were going to try everything to kind of save my life. So, I'm like really confused, thinking, what has happened here? Like, why am I being rushed back into surgery? But I knew it was something quite serious. So they put me on the operating table, and I'm seeing all of this mad panic around me. And, that moment kind of, your life kind of, flashes by, all the scenes of your life flash by. And here's me thinking, this is it. Like, I'm going to actually die here, like on this operating table, leaving five children behind. Like, who would have thought? I had so many plans, I had so much potential, I had so many things that I needed to do that I knew that I should have done, I could have done. But this is it. This is the end, This is what I'm going to leave behind. And, as the doctor's trying, putting me to sleep, putting the oxygen mask over my face, there was a moment where I literally just wanted to like push his hand away, because I needed a moment just to pause and reflect and just kind of gather my thoughts. But obviously it was, the situation was, it was an emergency situation, and they needed to operate on me. And so in that moment when they're putting me to sleep, the only thing that I'm uttering inside my heart is like, astaghfirullah, like, Ya Allah, forgive me. Ya Allah, forgive me. Ya Allah, forgive me. And that's what I'm uttering. And they've put me to sleep. But alhamdulillah, I woke up from that surgery. The surgery was successful. I was still really unwell. I had, I was pumped with morphine. I had like wires coming out of me. I was on oxygen. I couldn't get up, because apparently they'd kind of inflated a balloon inside me, and pumped it with water so that it compresses, wherever you're hemorrhaging from. And again, like I said, it's not an experience I'd had before, or I'd even heard about. So my stomach looked like as if I was still carrying a baby. So like, I was so confused. I couldn't hold my baby. I couldn't get up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't cough. I couldn't go to the bathroom. Like literally, I was just on the bed for days. And I'm so confused, trying to make sense of how coming into hospital to have a baby, and then going home the next day turned into this like 10 days being in hospital, not being able to function at all. Anyway, so after a few days of, like getting a little bit feeling a little bit better, I wanted to know what had happened. And then I asked for the doctor to come in, who was the consultant who was part of my surgery. And I remember the words that he said. He just said, "Oh, Mrs. Bano, you're lucky to be alive." And then he said that, I, obviously walked off. And then the nurse said, that doctor saved your life and the other two doctors saved your womb. And so I was like, okay, alhamdulillah, like you're kind of being grateful. And, alhamdulillah, I was grateful. After a few days, the doctors were really surprised by my recovery. I ended up going home, albeit in a wheelchair. But I went home, and, everyone's like so grateful. You went through this really like difficult time. You went through this really difficult surgery, but alhamdulillah, you're fine. Kind of, let's get back to business. But I just couldn't go back to business. And yet, up until that moment, for 10 years, I'd been home educating my children. And anybody who's home educated their children know how you constantly it's like balancing act, isn't it? And you've got so many things going on at the same time. So I was used to that kind of pressure. But, I was used to having a baby, coming home, getting on with home ed, doing my thing, whatever. And all of a sudden, I just couldn't do the basics. I couldn't just even get out of bed and function on a basic level around my family, to the point where I would snap at my children. And the children, I know the husbands have been getting it, but my children got it. So I would snap at the children. I'd kind of just abandon the baby. I'd hand him over to the older ones, and I'd just kind of leave. I'd walk out of the house. I'd shout, scream, I'd swear, and I'd never ever swear at the children. I'd swear directly at the kids, and I'd just abandon them. I'd walk out. And then I'd sit on a park bench, or I'd sit in my car, and I'd cry. I'd cry like a baby. I felt like a really rubbish mother. I felt really guilty. And I'd cry and cry and cry. Maybe I'd ring a friend, and then I'd go back home. I'd apologize to the children. I'd say, "I'm really, really sorry. I'm going to be better behaved tomorrow." And then I'd go back and do the same thing the next day. And I did this for weeks and months. And then I realized something's got to give. I wasn't doing justice to the kids. So then I made the really, really difficult decision of putting them back into school. I think that was the hardest thing I did. And I cried, and yet they were like, "Yes, we're going to school." And I think that upset me even more. But anyway, so I made some really kind of big changes in my life. Then my kids went back to school, and I started to work on myself. Now, at this moment, I hadn't come across your program, but I just exposed myself to anything and everything to just keep me sane, because I couldn't understand what was going wrong. I couldn't understand why I had this explosive behavior, this explosive anger, even though I think Yasmin mentioned it, and I think a couple of others, about how you were known as the angry one. I was known as the angry bird. I was the one that was always losing her temper really, really quickly. But this was next level. This was rage. And I knew that I'd done all of this effort with the children for 10 years, and I didn't want to I didn't want to ruin it, basically, with them. And I didn't want to end up doing damage to them that was irreversible. So I made the difficult decision of putting them into school, and I started working on myself. And I did anything and everything. I exposed myself to any material that was going to keep me afloat. I started meditating. You did a lot of breath work. I did a lot of somatic work, a lot of movement. I used to put the headphones on, used to put music on, close the curtains, and dance and dance and dance, to the point where the emotions would start coming out, and then I was crying by the end of it. So I was initially I was yeah, enjoying it. And by the end of it, I was probably on the floor crying my eyes out. I did a lot of meditation, waking up at 3-4 o'clock in the morning and just trying to find my inner peace. I did a lot of affirmations, a lot of visualizations, finding my safe space. I was literally, like I said, I was exposing myself to anything and everything to keep me afloat. And after a year, alhamdulillah, I felt like I wasn't the old version. I was a better version. of who I was, and I suppose an experience where you're kind of facing your own death does change you. It kind of makes you put a lot into perspective, makes you reflect a lot. It makes you question the way you've been living and the way you want to live and the kind of legacy that you want to leave behind. So, I put a lot of things into perspective. I qualified as a coach, and then I started working with women. Now, when I was working with women, and alhamdulillah, I was benefiting them, and I was sharing a lot of the things that I'd kind of learned and the kind of tools that I'd learned and applied and implemented. But I didn't really have a proper method. Like I was just kind of try this and try this and try this. And I knew that there was something missing in my delivery, or there was something missing in um, my ability to help them. And that's when I reached out to Myamine and I said, oh, because obviously everyone has trauma, even in the most benign everyday of life experiences. None of us can go through life without experiencing trauma and trauma affecting us. So I reached out to Myamine and I said, is there any kind of trauma training out there? Because I wanted to, I wanted to go on it so I could support my clients better. And that's when you mentioned your 7-week trauma recovery program at that time, which is now the BeyondTrauma Recovery Programme. And then part of the facilitation, I had to go through all of that 7 weeks worth of material. And as I went on that material, I started to realize, oh my gosh, like these were the tools that I was using, but then you had the science behind it, the knowledge behind it, the structure behind it, which I absolutely loved because it just makes it so much easier to, help an individual over a certain time frame with all of the content and all of the knowledge that they need to know and all of their tools that they need to implement. And then also we have the freedom to put in any tools that that we found beneficial. And so that's when I until then, I didn't realize I had PTSD. It was only when I did the trauma recovery program with you, I was like, oh, right. Okay. That makes sense. Now, I think it was Nazi that mentioned about, when she went to the doctor and the doctor said, you've got PTSD. Sometimes, not sometimes, we actually need a name for it because otherwise we're in this state of confusion thinking, what is wrong with me? Am I losing the plot? Is there a jinn? Am I being possessed? Am I just, am I going through perimenopausal symptoms and I'm like losing my marbles or whatever? But having that name being given to you just was like, oh, it was like the light bulb moment. So when I went on the program with you and I realized that's what I went through. I went through PTSD. And I think one of the comments was that we often think that it happens just to soldiers, it happens to people on the battleground. And it's not, it can happen to anyone. And it actually made me reflect and look back on the experiences in my own children as well, the experiences that they had, and then the behaviors that they were like displaying, how they actually have had PTSD or have symptoms of PTSD. And then when I talk about, I think Sister Samina said about, it wasn't grief or it wasn't trauma, it was just life. It made me reflect on my childhood and, especially those first like 7 years of your life when you are purely subconscious and there's no conscious, rational thought on all of those experiences that you have. And you look back at your childhood and your parenting and you think, oh my gosh, there was so much trauma there that I was, and so much symptoms of that trauma that I had, but then I had so many unhealthy coping mechanisms, or shall I say coping mechanisms that kept me safe. But at the same time, like, for example, I was always anxious. I was anxious to the point where, because I always saw my parents in a very unhealthy marriage where any dispute led to really toxic behavior or really toxic attitudes, etc. So for me, any kind of a dispute or any kind of conflict meant end of marriage, or it meant it was going to be really drastic. So I couldn't even have just a basic disagreement with my husband, because I was always anxious that it's going to lead to something negative, like it's going to lead to an explosion. But because you're so hyper vigilant, you're so anxious, I kind of manifested that in my relationships anyway. So, and then, it made me realize how I was carrying PTSD from my childhood, which then I took into my married life, which then I think with my experience with my son was like the wake up call. It was like something has to change. But I'd been walking wounded for as far back as I could remember, like for decades. And it was normal to be anxious. Feeling anxiety all the time was just a normal way of living and being. It's only when you experience internal peace that you think, what was that all about? Like, how was I functioning from that place for years? And it was through like breath work and meditation that when I started to experience those moments of bliss and peace, that I actually realized that we can be in the dunya and actually have this internal space within us where we can find peace, and it doesn't have to come from the outside of us. Like, we don't have to be controlling of the people and circumstances outside of us. We can actually find that internal bliss inside of us when we heal ourselves and we heal our traumas. So yeah, alhamdulillah, I'm so grateful for being on. I think that it's being on the program or being part of the facilitators just gives you so much more, like, yes, inshallah, we can do it. Like that collective, that community, that, it's not just one individual. Like Maya, you said, like, you want to leave that legacy behind so that you can continue to heal women even when you're no longer there. And I think that's what this community is about. And there's so many questions I always have, and I'll message Maya, and mashallah. The woman does have the answers. You do know your stuff.